In Chapter 3, we discuss world population and global inequality. The countries of the world vary widely in levels of material conditions. Some nations are disproportionately poor, with rampant hunger, disease, and illiteracy. Other nations are exceptionally well off with ample resources. Here are some facts concerning the uneven distribution of the world's wealth. First, the richest 2% of adults own more than half of the world's household wealth. The poorest half of the world's adult population own barely 1% of global wealth. About 1.2 billion people live in wealthy countries and about 5.8 billion live in poor countries. In 2012, there were 1,226 billionaires worldwide. The top 5 countries in number of billionaires were the US, followed by Russia, mainland China, Germany, and India. There's only sub-Saharan Africa had 1 billionaire in South Africa. The reasons for such global inequality include, as one might suspect, a degree of geographic isolation, climate, overpopulation, and natural resources. Another key determinant is the effect of power. The world has almost 1 million more people every 4 days. Each of these people needs food, water, medicine, and a home. Each of these people lives on the average of 69 years. That's the global average. And each of the humans strains the Earth's environment, adding to climate change, soil depletion, and limited fresh water. Look at the rate of global population growth. It took until 1830 to hit 1 billion people. The rate of growth depends on fertility rates, the average number of children born per woman, the woman being between the ages of 15 and 45. Y2.01, that's the number that stabilizes the population. It replaces each parent and those who don't have children. Half a child higher and we will see expansive growth. Differential fertility is the difference in fertility rates based on social categories. In 2011, developing nations have an average fertility rate of about 4.5, whereas developed nations have an average fertility rate of 1.7. Growth is occurring in areas where countries lack resources. Additional resources put more strain on already poor nations. We can reduce the fertility rates through economic development, family planning, and social changes. To illustrate, the natural increases, births minus death, in 2011 for the less developed countries was 81.1 million compared to 1.9 million in more developed countries. If the fertility rate in less developed countries are not lowered, their populations will continue to increase at very fast rates. In countries that have become more urbanized, industrialized, and modernized, the population growth has slowed. Let's look at that modern demographic transition. First, the agricultural stage, birth rates and deaths are both high. Women have more children and hopes that some will survive to adulthood. There's little population growth. In the transition stage, birth rates remain high, but death rates drop due to improvements in sanitation and sewage, and there's a population explosion. Sewage, better medication, diets, and hygiene. And at the industrial or urban stage, traditional customs have changed and birth rates decline. Women have access to birth control technology, for example. The population stabilizes. Overall, due to increased urbanization, better access to contraceptives, and more women being educated, the global fertility rate has declined from an average of 4.92 children per woman in 1950 to 2.56 now. The demographic transition in Europe took 200 years, but developing nations today are going through the transition much faster. This is a good thing. The world can't wait 200 years to bring fertility rates down. This critical cohort under age 20 is important to watch in less developed countries. If the fertility rate in this group is high, the population will continue to increase. If the growth rate continues to slow, the demographic transition with its accompanying urbanization, medical advances, and the liberation of women from traditional gender roles will have worked. In more developed countries, the population may be threatened by not having enough children who will support people as they age. This is already a problem in Japan, where they've reached negative population growth. As a result of international efforts, fertility rates have fallen worldwide, but we still need to see more of a drop in developing nations. The United Nations estimate that about 200 million people worldwide would like to prevent pregnancy but are not using effective contraception, either because they cannot afford it or are not knowledgeable about it. It is estimated that it would take 8 billion to make birth control readily available on a global basis. Such availability would reduce the projected world population from 10 billion to 8 billion during the next 60 years. Beginning with the Reagan and Bush administration, the U.S. did not support international efforts aimed at contraception use and education. Clinton supported efforts, but George W. Bush revoked them again. Obama reinstated U.S. support for United Nations Population Fund. The World Bank estimates that about 8 billion would make birth control readily available. The availability of and proper training in how to use birth control is crucial to slowing population growth globally. Cultural values about the familial role of women and about children as evidence of the father's virility or as a hedge against poverty in old age must be changed. Religious beliefs that resist the use of contraceptives are obstacles to population control. And change in women's roles is the most significant social change needed to reduce fertility. When women are isolated from activities outside the home, their worth depends largely on their ability to bear and raise children. This diminishes as they gain access to places and networks outside of the home. The World Bank defines the global poverty line as living on less than $1.25 per day. 1.4 billion people live below this line. Extreme poverty is concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. Global poverty has declined since 1981, but the gap between the rich and the poor is wider than ever. What is poverty? Poverty affects an individual's life chances. The chances throughout one's life cycle to live and experience, a high quality life. A problem with living in poverty: you lack not only resources but the power to change your situation. If we went on a vegetarian diet and did not waste food, the world produced enough to feed at least 10 billion people. Why are people dying of malnourishment then? What is food insecurity? Not knowing where your food is coming from or knowing if you will have food. An obvious source of the problem is rapid population growth, which distorts the distribution system and strains the productive capacity of various nations. The annual increase in population of 75 to 80 million people requires an enormous increase in grain production just to stay even. But increasing food production is difficult when there are changes at the productivity level. The following affect both rich and poor countries: declining topsoil, water shortages, air pollution and toxic chemicals, leveling of land for homes and roads, and eating more meat. Most population growth in poor areas that cannot afford the fuel to remain agriculturally productive. In addition, natural disasters affect poor nations more than affect nations because they are not equipped to handle them. Another way to explain the food problem is to view it as a poverty problem. Food supplies are adequate, but people that have the resources to afford them, don't always. Because the poor cannot afford available food, they go hungry. Grain surplus is handled by feeding more than a third of the world's production to animals. Crops allowed to rot or plowed under to keep prices high. Surplus milk is fed to pigs or dumped to keep the prices high. The notion of food scarcity is an obvious distortion when the major headache of many agricultural experts around the world is how to reduce mountains of surplus and keep prices high. The problem of food scarcity lies then in the social organization of food production and distribution. We will pick up in part 2.